Chapter 1. The Lady in the Lavender Shawl. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings in St. Mary Mead, when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and mystery. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles flashing in a steady rhythm, when something unusual caught her sharp blue eyes. Across the lane outside the post office stood a woman Miss Marple had never seen before, a woman dressed entirely in shades of lavender. From her soft wool gloves to the elegant shawl that draped her shoulders like a whisper of perfume, there was a certain foreignness about her. Not quite French, not quite English, something in between, Miss Marple decided. The lady's posture was upright, her chin tilted as though she were accustomed to being observed, but preferred to remain unreadable. In her gloved hand she clutched a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with gold string. Miss Marple watched as the woman spoke quietly to Mrs. Harding, the postmistress, who looked both curious and alarmed. The lavender-clad stranger seemed to be asking for directions, or perhaps for someone by name. Then, quite suddenly, she turned and walked briskly toward the lane leading to the Vicarage. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-her. "Now that," she murmured, "is most interesting." An hour later, the peace of the village was broken. The church bell, which usually tolled only on Sundays, rang out a harsh and uneven peal. Miss Marple knew instantly that something had gone wrong. By the time she arrived at the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver a jar of her famous damson jam, the scene was abuzz with whispering villagers. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, stood pale and flustered in the doorway, trying to soothe the clamor. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped, "such a dreadful thing." A stranger found fainting in the study. The most peculiar woman, too, dressed in lavender. She had a golden scarf about her neck, and now it's vanished. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Vanished, you say?" "Yes, quite gone. She had it when she arrived. Mr. Clement saw it himself. Such a beautiful thing, shimmering gold threads like sunlight. But after she collapsed, it wasn't there. The doctor says she was drugged, poor creature." Inside the vicarage study, the air was thick with the smell of lavender and camphor. The lady lay upon the sofa, breathing shallowly. Even in her distress she looked elegant, her clothes carefully chosen, her hair pinned just so. Miss Marple noted the small details that others missed: a faint perfume that wasn't English, the nervous twitch of her left hand, the faint red mark around her neck where the scarf might have been tied. Dr. Haydock straightened and frowned. "She'll recover, but she's had a shock. Something's been slipped into her tea, or perhaps a sedative of some kind." Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "Or perhaps she took it herself. One never knows with strangers." The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were a striking shade of gray, sharp and filled with fear. Where am I?" "In St. Mary Mead, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You were found in distress at the vicarage." The lady's gaze darted around the room, as if searching for something. "My scarf," she whispered. "It was gold pure silk. Have you seen it?" "No, I'm afraid not," the vicar replied uneasily. "It seems to have disappeared." The woman's expression changed. Fear gave way to despair. "Then it's too late," she murmured. "They've found me." Before anyone could question her, she fainted once more. That night, St. Mary Mead was alive with speculation. At the Blue Boar Inn, where gossip spread faster than influenza, theories flew thick and fast. Some said she was a foreign spy. Others swore she was an heiress fleeing from her husband. But Miss Marple, sipping her cocoa at home, thought otherwise. People never vanish without reason, she told her canary, who chirped in mild agreement. And scarves, especially golden ones, rarely go missing unless they conceal something worth finding. The next morning brought another surprise. A constable arrived at the vicarage with grim news. A man's body had been found near the old railway bridge, strangled with fibers of gold thread caught in his collar dot. Miss Marple's teacup trembled only slightly. "How very curious," she said. "It seems Our Lady in Lavender brings more than color to St. Mary Mead." Later that day, Miss Marple went to visit the stranger again. The woman, now awake, looked frightened but defiant. "You shouldn't have helped me," she whispered. "He'll come back for it." "For what, my dear?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "The scarf?" The woman's lips trembled. It wasn't just a scarf. It was the key, the proof, hidden in the hem. "I should never have brought it here." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes twinkling with quiet understanding. "Then perhaps, my dear, you have brought it to precisely the right place." Outside, the church clock struck noon, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked sharply. Miss Marple, in her gentle, unassuming way, began to knit once more, her mind already unraveling the tangle of threads, golden and otherwise, that fate had laid before her dot by evening. She knew what must be done. She wrote a brief note to Inspector Craddock, sealed it with wax, and placed it by her teacup. "If I'm right," she said softly to herself, "then our murderer is closer than anyone suspects. Closer, perhaps, than the Lavender Lady ever dreamed." As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple glanced once more toward the vicarage. The curtains glowed with lamplight, and inside, the lady in lavender sat motionless watching the lane, waiting for someone who might already be watching her. And somewhere, hidden in the quiet English dusk, a golden scarf shimmered faintly in the shadows, its threads catching the last rays of the dying sun, its secrets far from spent. Chapter 2. A Whisper in St. Mary Mead. Morning dawned gray and uncertain over St. Mary Mead. A mist hung low over the thatched roofs, softening the sharp edges of the world. To the untrained eye, the village looked as peaceful as a painting. But for those who lived there, especially those with a nose for trouble, something felt, decidedly amiss. At precisely 7 o'clock. Miss Jane Marple opened her curtains and peered out, her eyes as sharp as a sparrow's. From her bedroom window she could see the vicarage garden, and there, half hidden by the fog, was the unmistakable figure of the Lavender Lady, walking slowly among the roses. She was bareheaded now, her blonde hair catching the pale light. Every few moments she glanced nervously over her shoulder, as though expecting someone or something. "Now why," murmured Miss Marple, "would a woman recovering from shock feel compelled to wander the garden at dawn?" She dressed quickly, wrapped her pink shawl about her shoulders, and set off toward the high street. She didn't go directly to the vicarage, oh no. Jane Marple never moved in straight lines when a mystery was unfolding. Instead, she made a polite detour to Mrs. Price Ridley's cottage, where gossip was as plentiful as tea. Mrs. Price Ridley opened the door with a suspicious squint. "Oh, it's you, Miss Marple. Do come in. You've heard, I suppose?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "I've heard a great deal, my dear, but perhaps not quite what you've heard." The older woman lowered her voice dramatically. "The lady in lavender, she's staying at the vicarage, you know. I'm told she was seen arguing with a man at the station 2 days ago. A foreigner, dark and rather rough-looking. They say she dropped a gold-threaded scarf, and now he's dead, found strangled, just outside the old railway bridge." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Yes, so I've been told. A very tragic affair. Still, I'm sure the police are doing their best." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "The police never notice what's right under their noses. Mark my words, Miss Marple, she's hiding something. And I shan't sleep easy until she's gone from St. Mary Mead." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple felt the faintest tremor in the air, a sense of unease that seemed to cling to every hedge and gate-post. It wasn't just curiosity this time. It was fear, the kind that grows like mold in small places, feeding on whispers dot by mid-morning. The talk in the village had reached a fever pitch. The postmistress claimed the lady had mailed a letter to Switzerland. The grocer swore he saw her crying in the churchyard. Even the milkman reported that his deliveries to the vicarage had gone mysteriously missing. Miss Marple, however, preferred to rely on observation rather than chatter, so she walked to the vicarage herself ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book and found Mrs. Clement arranging flowers in the hall. "Oh, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Clement in a breathless rush, "it's been dreadful. The poor lady, she calls herself Mrs. Duval, is quite beside herself. She insists she must leave at once, but the doctor forbids it, and the inspector has been here twice already." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple mildly. "And what does Inspector Craddock make of it?" "He's baffled, I think. The scarf has not been found, though they've searched the grounds. And there's talk of a jewel theft in London, something to do with the golden scarf used for smuggling. It all sounds too ghastly for words." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Yes, my dear, life does have a way of becoming ghastly when gold is involved." Just then a door creaked open, and Mrs. Duval appeared. She looked pale but composed, her lavender shawl draped carefully over one arm. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "might I speak with you? Alone?" They went into the garden, where the autumn air smelled faintly of wet leaves and secrets. Mrs. Duval's voice trembled. "You must believe me, I am not what they say. I came here because I was desperate. I thought I could hide just for a few days." "Hide from whom, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Duval hesitated. "From a man named Victor Larocque. He was once my husband's partner. They were in the antique trade in Nice. Victor dealt in rare fabrics, silks, and other things. He used my scarf, to conceal a stolen brooch from the Duke of Montreux. I found out and tried to stop him, but he threatened me." Miss Marple nodded, the knitting needles of her mind already clicking. "And the man found near the railway bridge?" Her voice broke. "That was Victor. He found me. He must have followed me here. But I swear to you I didn't kill him." Miss Marple placed a hand on her arm. "My dear Mrs. Duval, one doesn't need to swear to me. One only needs to tell the truth." Before the woman could reply, a shadow fell across the garden. Inspector Craddock had arrived, his hat tipped back, his expression grave. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Duval, I'm afraid I must ask some rather awkward questions. As the inspector questioned her, Miss Marple listened in silence, her mind weaving connections. A scarf gone missing, a man strangled, a frightened woman who seemed half guilty, half innocent, and somewhere behind it all a whisper that didn't belong. That whisper reached her again that night. She was at home, mending her lace gloves by the fire, when she heard a faint rustle outside the window, followed by a low murmur of voices. She moved quietly to the curtain and peered out. Two figures stood by the gate, men in dark coats, speaking hurriedly. She caught only one word before they vanished into the fog. Scarf. Miss Marple straightened slowly. The word echoed through her parlor like a cold wind. Someone else was looking for it. Someone who didn't care who got in the way. The next morning she found a small envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single golden thread and a note written in a woman's delicate hand. "Forgive me. I had no choice." Then Miss Marple sat back, her pulse quickening. "Elm," she murmured. "For lavender or for Larocque?" At that moment the church bell tolled once, slow and heavy, and somewhere in the distance a dog began to howl. It was the kind of sound that made even the bravest hearts falter. Miss Marple rose, her mind already racing ahead. "A whisper in St. Mary Mead," she said softly, "and the storm is about to break." Chapter 3. The Unexpected Visitor at Tea. By 4 o'clock, October's light had gone the color of pale honey, thin, cool, reluctant to linger over the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, who held that tea at 4 o'clock was the point around which civilization turned, laid out her prettiest cups, white porcelain with a ring of forget-me-nots, a plate of her dangerously good seed cake, and a jar of scarlet quince jelly that gleamed like a warning. She expected Mrs. Clement to pop in. The vicar's wife had a way of arriving just as the kettle sang, but the little brass bell over Miss Marple's front door trembled at 5 minutes to the hour 2, early for Mrs. Clement, and a man stepped into the warm, lamplit room as though the light itself had invited him. He was neat to the point of calculation. A charcoal suit, a coat neither new nor shabby, boots polished to a diplomatic shine. His face was the sort that did not wish to be remembered smooth, agreeable, almost forgettable. Only the eyes argued with the rest. They were quick and unblinking, skimming the room with a collector's hunger. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with practiced modesty. "Alistair Reed, I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "I usually do," Miss Marple replied, offering him the sugar tongs. "1 lump or 2, Mr. Reed?" "2, if I may." He smiled, and his gaze hopped from the mantel clock to the knitting basket, to the envelope on the escritoire, an envelope no longer there. Miss Marple had tucked it into the pages of Walton's Lives before putting the kettle on. "I'm with Halbert and Phipps, the insurance syndicate. We insure a number of regrettably desirable objects, one of which, I fear, has led me to your charming village." "Objects do bring people together," Miss Marple said mildly, pouring the tea. "Sometimes with charm, sometimes with handcuffs. Quite." He laughed too quickly. "I should never risk a joke with a lady of your reputation." "Oh, I haven't one," she said. "At least, not the sort anyone would desire." He accepted his cup and sat carefully choosing the chair that faced both door and window. Not a policeman's habit, precisely. More like a man who disliked surprises. "I imagine, Miss Marple, that you have heard whispers about a certain golden scarf." Miss Marple sliced the seed cake. a whisper or two. In villages, whispers come with the milk. Indeed. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to something conspiratorial. The scarf was a novelty piece, lion silk threaded with gilt, made on commission for a client who enjoys theatricality. It was last seen en route from London to Monaco, and, unless I am mistaken, subsequently employed to conceal a brooch of considerable value, a sapphire, known as the Celandine Star, lifted from the Duke of Montrose townhouse. The thief died somewhat prematurely near our railway bridge, Miss Marple said. Quite a nasty bend there. Nasty enough to break a neck or twist a story. Mr. Reed's eyes flickered. Just so. The brooch has not been recovered. The scarf has not been recovered. Yet some parties, he added, examining the thin steam rising from his cup, seem very certain that both are precisely where they wish them to be. Certainty, Miss Marple observed, is a luxury often purchased with deception. He regarded her for a moment as if she were an unexpected chess piece. Then he smiled again. "May I be frank, Miss Marple? I have always found frankness less tiring than the alternative. I believe the woman they call Mrs. Duval, your lady in lavender, knows where the scarf is, and I believe she may be trying to arrange a quiet exchange. There are men in the village who are alert to such opportunities. If she meets the wrong one at the wrong hour, someone else will die. Another cup?" Miss Marple asked. He blinked. "Oh, yes, thank you." She poured, watching the hand that steadied his saucer. Left hand, rain-spattered cuff. A thread clung to the wool, shining faintly until his thumb swept it away. Not gold brass luster silk. Near enough to pretend. His boots held a scallop of dried mud, not from the village green, pale, chalky, but the clay by the old mill stream. A London man would not pick that path unless he'd been shown it or had reason to avoid being seen on the road. The bell jangled again lightly, like a breath. Miss Iris Bellamy, the village seamstress, slipped into the room in a gust of cold air and lavender soap. A clever, nervous girl with pin-scratched fingers and the clear eyes of someone who noticed seams long before they split. "Oh, Miss Marple, I beg your pardon. I didn't know you had a gentleman." Iris clutched a wrapped parcel to her chest. Her gaze snagged on Mr. Reed's watch chain, then skittered away. "All gentlemen are improved by tea," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Reed, this is Miss Bellamy, miracle worker of hem and gusset, and the soul of discretion." Iris reddened, and then, remembering her parcel, she unwrapped it to reveal a narrow strip of silk, a ribbon, the color of ripe wheat in sunlight. She kept her voice low. "I brought it as you asked, Miss Marple. The lion silk with gilt filaments. I matched it to the fiber the inspector left with me. It's identical, but there's something else, something peculiar." "Peculiarities," Miss Marple said, "tend to be the little doors through which a whole story walks." "The selvage," Iris whispered, smoothing the ribbon flat on Miss Marple's tablecloth. "Here, see this line of laddering? It's not a factory flaw. It's been done with a very fine needle. Someone stitched teeny loops into the edge and then pulled them out, leaving a faint pattern. It's deliberate, like a code." Mr. Reed's agreeable face sharpened. "A code," he repeated, savoring the word like sugar. Miss Marple cut the seed cake into squares and placed one neatly on Iris's saucer. A code does explain certain people's sudden appreciation for haberdashery. It explains murder better, Iris blurted, then looked horrified at herself. I mean, if someone needed the pattern to find where the brooch went, or the pattern itself was the key, Miss Marple said, eyes bright. A thief wise enough to know letters betray and numbers can be guessed might prefer stitches, so many loops, so many spaces. A safe deposit number, perhaps, or a locker key, mon. Mr. Reed reached out a careful finger, but did not touch the ribbon. Miss Bellamy, you are remarkable. Iris flushed furiously. Oh, I just mend things. I also brought this. She produced a tiny envelope. Inside lay a sliver of silk with 2 minuscule knots and a dainty slash, as if a sharp nail had snagged it. I found it on the vicarage porch, caught in the splinter by the bench where that lady sits to take the air. Miss Marple's kettle sighed as it cooled. Threads, stitches, knots. Whispers turning into lines of music one could play if only one knew the key. Mr. Reed, Miss Marple said sweetly, you spoke of parties alert to opportunity. You may include yourself among them, I think. You did not bother to deny it. If I were a less scrupulous man, Miss Marple, I would be here without my card and with a pocket free of warrants. But I am bound by a contract, and by a very strong directive to avoid scandal. My employers do not wish to see titled dukes in the papers nor golden scarves in the dock. If I can retrieve what was stolen quietly and keep a frightened woman alive in the bargain, I shall consider myself well repaid. And if the frightened woman knows more than is safe? Miss Marple asked, her voice the soft padding of an indoor cat that might, at any instant, become a tiger. Then frightened women become brave witnesses, he said, just as the bell rang a third time, this time not the delicate tremor of courtesy, but the urgent clang of someone who had left. Courtesy behind the door burst open, Mrs. Duval pale, breathless, her lavender shawl thrown on as though she'd remembered halfway down the lane, stumbled into the room. She shut the door, put her back against it, and looked like a swan forced into a hunter's hut. Miss Marple, she whispered, eyes darting to Iris, then Mr. Reed, then back to Miss Marple's steady face. Forgive me. I had no one else. They are in the lane. 2 men, one with a scar. Most inconvenient, Miss Marple said. Do take the chair nearest the fire, dear. Your lips are blue. Mrs. Duval obeyed like a child, hands trembling so badly that the purple fringe of her shawl quivered. When she saw the ribbon on the table, her breath caught. Not yours, Mr. Reed said. It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes. No, but the same weave, the same message. Miss Marple placed a cup into those shaking hands and sat opposite. You addressed a note to me last night, she said gently. A single golden thread and an apology. I believe you thought to come here today long before you were followed. A shiver went through Mrs. Duval, more resignation than fear. Yes, she murmured. I am tired of being afraid, and I am tired of lying. My name is Lydia, not what did I tell the vicar. Lavra, Lydia Duval. She looked at Mr. Reed. And Victor Larocque was not a partner. He was my husband's enemy. He would have killed us both for what we knew. What you knew, Miss Marple said, or what you had. Lydia met her eyes with a steadiness that surprised the room. Both. Outside a car rattled past. Male voices drifted faint, then gone. Mr. Reed did not flinch, but Miss Marple saw his hand shift to the little pocket where men kept things that might keep them safe. "Lydia," Miss Marple said, "tell us the truth entire without embroidery. There is so much of that about today." Lydia took a breath. "My husband, Henry, dealt in antique textiles. He loved them, truly loved them, the way some men love paintings. A dealer named Victor began buying through us, but paid in notes from questionable sources. Then came the brooch, the celandine star. We refused it. Victor laughed. He said he could pluck dukes like plums, and we were foolish not to eat. He used a scarf to conceal the brooch for travel. I saw him do it. I watched how he stitched the hem, how he counted the loops. He cut the end of the scarf and threw it into the fire. I still smelled the burning silk. Iris flinched as if the imagined scent had singed her fingers. Henry told Victor to get out, Lydia continued. Victor smiled and said we had already made ourselves guilty by witnessing him. Then he left the scarf with us deliberately, I believe. He wanted to see who would come for it. And they came. Men who looked like clerks until you noticed their hands. Men who knew how to wait. I panicked. I cut the hem too, she faltered, then went on with sudden fierceness. To keep the message, the code. Mr. Reed was perfectly still. And where is it now? In a place no one would think to admire, Lydia said, a tiny, almost mad smile ghosting across her mouth. A place for small vanities. I hid it in a powder compact and threw the compact into the church charity bin. It will be sitting in the jumble behind the organ, under old hats, smelling of mothballs and hymenals, unless some clever woman has already bought it to keep pins. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. A jumble sale salvation. Not at all the worst church work I've encountered. Mr. Reed rose halfway from his chair. We must go now. Quietly, Miss Marple, not quite yet, Miss Marple said, and in that moment her voice had the authority of an abbess. The men in the lane, did you recognize them, Mr. Reed? One, he admitted. Alan Rook. He arranges introductions for objects that ought not to have owners. Then he won't dare the vicarage again today, Miss Marple said. But he will dare a little house with a kettle. He will dare anywhere a frightened woman runs. We shall oblige him to dare something else. She went to the tall corner cupboard, extracted a tin of biscuits, and from behind it, an item that no one but Miss Marple could have kept in a biscuit cupboard with such holy domesticity, a police whistle, a relic of a nephew-in-law who had the good sense to gift it to the one woman in England least likely to play with it. She set it beside the sugar bowl like a new piece of china. Mr. Reed, she said, you will leave by the back garden. Iris will go with you. She can take you the short way along the hedgerow to the church vestry. The ivy hides the gate. In the vestry there is a cupboard marked banners, old. Behind the red Pentecost banner you will find a crate with a blue stripe. The compact is inside. It is pale green bakelite with a crack across the mirror. Mr. Reed blinked. You cannot know that. I don't, Miss Marple said pleasantly, but churchwomen do. Our Mrs. Price Ridley helped organize the jumble. She mentioned, quite without thinking, that the vicar had set aside old banners and a box of lady trifles to keep them from the children until the sale. She never remembers what she tells me, and if the compact isn't there, Then the banner is, and behind the banner a church mouse who will know where the compact scampered. Off you go." She turned to Iris. "Take the shawl from my chair and wrap it over your hair. In fog, shapes are safer than faces." Iris's hands shook as she tied the shawl, but her voice was steady. "Yes, Miss Marple." She paused, looking at Lydia. "We'll fetch it." Miss Marple nodded. "And you, my dear Lydia, will sit very quietly and finish your tea." As the back door sighed shut, Miss Marple went to the hearth and straightened the tongs. She took one square of seed cake and crumbled it onto a saucer bait, as innocent as a nursery treat. Then she sat, took up her knitting, and placed the police whistle beside the kettle where the steam would keep it warm and ready. They did not wait long. A scuff on the threshold, a shadow that hesitated. Then the front door opened without the bell's permission, and a man's figure filled the passage. He wore the kind of smile that never reached the eyes because it never bothered with the soul. A small scar clipped his jaw, a white thread in dark cloth. "Mrs. Duval," he said amiably, as if he had been invited yesterday and apologized for arriving today. "How fortunate to find you with friends." "Fortune," Miss Marple said, "is so often a matter of timing, Mr. Rook." He turned, surprised. "You have the advantage of me." "Oh, I rarely possess that," said Miss Marple, her needles click-clicking like a pet cricket in a cardboard box. "But I do have a memory which is an old woman's dowry. You bought a brooch once from a girl who believed you were rescuing her from ruin. You sold it for 3 times the price and told her it had been lost in the post. She cried so bitterly that the salt ate the silver fox from her collar. Alan Rook considered her in the way men consider stairways. Will it be a climb or a fall?" He smiled. "I believe you're mistaking me for someone sympathetic." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Do sit. We neglect the duties of hospitality at our peril." He stepped not into the room, but to the sideboard where the escritoire stood, the spot Mr. Reed's eyes had weighed and dismissed. Rook's hand slid across the wood with the lazy intimacy of a thief who knows furniture by touch. He opened the top drawer without asking. Empty. The second. Ledgers, knitting patterns, a bundle of letters tied with tape dot. Miss Marple did not stop him. She did not move at all until his fingers lit on Walton's lives. Then she rose with such swiftness that the knitting slid, a silver cascade, to her lap. "Do be careful," she said, voice like a frost. "That book is older than your conscience." He smiled and withdrew his hand obedient, almost meek. "A performance, and not a bad one. My apologies." He wheeled on Lydia with that same gentle courtesy that any woman with a sister knows to distrust. "You've had a run, my dear. I only want what isn't yours. Give me the scarf." "I don't have it," Lydia whispered. He sighed as if hurt by other people's stubbornness. "People say that so often when they have already arranged to trade." "You must hate competition," Miss Marple said. "It breeds such bad manners." Rook's eyes flattened. "I am not here for manners, madam." "No," said Miss Marple. "You are here for a compact in a crate behind a banner in a vestry. You are here because you followed a man who pretends to be an insurance clutch, and because you imagine this house a softer target than a church cupboard. Alas." "Alas?" Rook's mouth twitched. "Alas," Miss Marple repeated, and put the whistle to her lips. The sound that followed was not the pretty peep of a toy, but a blade of noise that sliced the afternoon in two. The nearest dog howled. Down the lane, a constable, who had been told by his inspector to keep a friendly eye on Miss Marple's cottage, jumped so violently that he spilled tobacco over his boots. Rook swore. His hand darted not for a weapon, but for Lydia's arm. Miss Marple moved like a trick of candlelight. The saucer flew from her hand, scattering seed cake in an arc that would have delighted a gull. Rook flinched only an instant, but it was enough. The front door exploded inward as the constable barreled through, and Inspector Craddock himself, summoned by a short-cut and a guess, filled the doorway with the outraged dignity of a man who loathes being exactly right. "Mr. Rook," Craddock said, cold and enormous, "I've been composing a lecture for you all afternoon. Imagine my relief to deliver it in Miss Marple's parlor." Rook's smile collapsed. He lifted his hands with the mocking grace of men who think handcuffs are a misunderstanding. "Inspector." Craddock nodded to the constable, who relieved Rook of his illusions. Lydia made a sound like a torn hem and clutched the arm of Miss Marple's chair. Through the window, Miss Marple saw a flit of movement across the hedgerow. Iris's shawl, dark as a rook, and just behind it, Mr. Reed's careful shape. "Bring him," Craddock said. "And Miss Marple, if you have any more theatrics planned, warn me so I may sell tickets." "Only the quiet sort," Miss Marple replied. 10 minutes later, Iris and Mr. Reed crowded into the doorway, flushed, dusted with cobwebs, faces alight with a fierce and unlikely triumph. Iris held the green compact in both hands as if it were a christening cup. "It was right where you said," she panted. Behind the banner, the mirrors cracked like a spider web, and inside, oh, she opened it. Nestled in the powder lay a rolled strip of gold-threaded silk, as thin as a secret and twice as dangerous. Along its edge the ghost stitches marched, loop, space, loop, loop, space, loop, an uneven music. Craddock whistled, not with Miss Marple's instrument, but softly, the way men do when they see work they respect. "We'll have the Yard's cipher bods on that." "And then, no," Mr. Reed said quietly, and for the first time his neatness unbuttoned into something like conviction. "Allow me. The fewer rooms that know about dukes and scarves, the better. Miss Marple, Miss Bellamy, Mrs. Duval, if I may borrow your eyes." Miss Marple did not mind lending anything she could easily retrieve. She bent close. "The loops are not evenly spaced. Some tight, some loose. And see, here every sixth stitch is a little higher. A grid," Iris breathed, "rows and columns." "Or a melody," Lydia whispered, unexpected poetry in her voice. "Henry used to say weaving is music." Threads playing notes across a loom. Mr. Reed's finger hovered above the scene. It could be a locker in London, or a safe deposit in Brighton. The pattern might correspond to numbers. He looked at Miss Marple. "Forgive me. I should ask permission." He slipped a tiny pencil from his pocket and made dots on a scrap of paper, not touching the silk, only shadowing it. 6 long, 3 short. 2 long, 1 short. That could be 62 or 63 or blast. "Not blast," Miss Marple murmured. She picked up her knitting and with a dancer's grace pulled 3 stitches, then 2, then 1, letting them ladder down a row. People make patterns in the ways they know. If the thief was a man who knitted, I shall eat the vicar's hat. But the woman who hemmed this look how she favors her left when she turns the work, left-handed and fond of sevens. Look at these little indulgent sevens every so often. They're a habit, not a cipher. Left-handed, Craddock said slowly. The fibers on Mahog's collar twisted clockwise. Haydock remarked it likely meant a left-hander tied the ligature. Lydia closed her eyes. "Not me," she said, and for the first time it was not a defense, but a prayer. "No," Miss Marple said. "Not you." Silence fell like a velvet cloth. Outside a rook barked a laugh from the churchyard yew. Craddock cleared his throat. "I'll take the compact, if you please." Mr. Reed hesitated, then handed it over. "Handle it like a saint's relic," he warned. "It may save us a scandal. It may save a life," Miss Marple said. "And I would like that very much." The inspector gave her a look that was half admiration, half appeal. "Miss Marple, if I leave Rook in the charge of my constable and take this to the station for safekeeping, will you avoid creating further opportunities for headlines?" "I find headlines vulgar," Miss Marple said, and touched Lydia's wrist. "You will stay here tonight, dear. I have a bed with an eiderdown that forgives sins. Tomorrow we shall tell the truth to whoever truly wants it." After they had gone, Craddock with his prize, Rook glowering between handcuffs, Mr. Reed vanishing into the dusk like a comma that promised more sentence, Miss Marple closed her door and set the chain. She put another log on the fire and sat with Lydia and Iris, the three of them forming a small, stubborn constellation against whatever darkness paced the lane. "Miss Marple," Iris said at last, voice small, "the knots, the left-handed knots, do you think the killer is a woman?" Miss Marple's needles paused one bright fang caught in the firelight. "I think," she said gently, "that murder is less a matter of sex than of practice. But I also think St. Mary Mead is full of practical women." Lydia stared into the flames. "Victor had many enemies," she whispered. "Men he cheated, women whose husbands he ruined. But there is someone else, someone who watched him with the patience of a cat at a mouse-hole. Someone who knew the pattern and smiled at it." "Then we shall watch the watchful," Miss Marple said, "and we shall let them think we are very busy with seed cake and shawls." A soft tap came at the window only, a twig, reaching like a curious finger. They all started just the same. Miss Marple laughed at herself, a small, kind laugh. "Courage," she said. "It is merely October being dramatic." Still, when she went to bank the fire, she slipped the police whistle into the pocket of her cardigan, and, with the other hand, touched the hidden note she had tucked into Walton's Lives. "Forgive me. I had no choice. LL for Lydia, yes, but also L for left. L for loops. O for lies, perhaps. The village was a dictionary, and every letter contained a scandal. Go to bed, both of you," she said at last. "Leave the washing up for morning." A clear sink never solved a crime. They obeyed, as people do when an old woman's kindness steadies into command. Miss Marple washed the cups herself, listening to the small, companionable sounds of the house, settling timbers sighing, the clock's pianist tick. Somewhere in the lane a fox barked, sharp as a match flare. When the last cup was dried and the last blind drawn, she took her knitting to the armchair by the window and sat in the hush that stoops over villages after 10. She did not knit. She watched the garden through the lace. She watched the lane. She watched the angle of the moon on the vicarage gate and counted, without appearing to count the shadows that passed, the clumsy, the careful, the curious dot at 10:30. The church bell spoke once. A moth battered itself against the lamp, frantic with love for a thing that could only burn it. Miss Marple rose, her knees as nimble as propriety allowed, and went to her escritoire. From beneath Walton's Lives she drew the note and the envelope that had once held a single golden thread. Inside the envelope, when she pinched the corners, there rustled something that had not been there before, so slight she might have dismissed it as dust. But Miss Marple trusted smallness. She shook the envelope gently. A second thread, finer than hair, slithered onto the blotter, a thread that looked gold at first glance and then revealed itself in the lamplight as something else entirely. Not silk at all, but wire, the sort used to string pearls. "Well now," she murmured, delighted and appalled in equal measure. "Who put you there, my dear?" No one had come near the escritoire save Rook, and he had not had time to be delicate. Which left someone who could be delicate with a house, delicate with terror, delicate with truth. Miss Marple lifted the wire with her embroidery needle and held it against the window's faint moon. Knots again. Tiny crimps like teeth marks. The same pattern, but with one flaw corrected. A kindness or a warning. She smiled, a small, ferocious thing, and snuffed the lamp. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the sleeping village. "We shall whisper back." And outside October's fog curled tighter around St. Mary Mead, as if the night itself were a shawl lavender at the edges, gold where the lamplight touched it, and full of secrets woven so carefully that only a woman with a lifetime of quiet could hope to unpick them. Chapter 4. The Golden Scarf Appears It was a Thursday morning when St. Mary Mead held its breath. A dense fog clung to the hedgerows like old secrets. Even the sparrows, usually so chatty at dawn, seemed to have sworn a vow of silence. The whole village appeared shrouded in something more than mist, as though the world itself was waiting for Miss Marple to make her next deduction. Inside her cozy sitting-room at Dane Mead Cottage, Miss Marple was arranging daffodils in a glass vase when a sharp knock came at the door. It was not the hesitant tapping of a villager nor the firm authority of Inspector Craddock. It was quick, nervous, and unfamiliar. When she opened it, Iris Bellamy, the seamstress, stood there, her cheeks flushed, eyes wide, and hands gripping a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple," she gasped, "you must come quickly. They've found it, the scarf, the golden scarf." For one heartbeat, even Miss Marple forgot her flowers. "My dear girl," she said softly, "I was wondering when it would reappear." The scarf had been discovered in the most poetic of places, the churchyard behind St. Mary Mead's chapel. Old Tom, the gardener, had found it caught in the iron gate by the yew trees. It shimmered faintly even through the fog, a fragile ribbon of gold glinting with dew, like sunlight trapped in a web dot. When Miss Marple and Iris arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching her coat as if decency itself depended on it. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, frowning as though the sight of beauty offended him. And at the center of it all, Inspector Craddock, looking grimly satisfied. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, touching his hat. Seems our missing treasure wanted a bit of fresh air. Miss Marple crouched by the gate, her sharp eyes narrowing. "How curious. The scarf appears entirely unsoiled, yet it's been raining for 2 nights. Craddock nodded. "Exactly my thought. Someone put it there recently, no more than an hour ago. The scarf was exquisite, silk finer than spider thread, embroidered with a pattern of looping gold filaments that seemed to twist and dance when the light struck them. Around one edge, the faintest shadow of a tear had been mended, carefully, skillfully. Miss Marple's fingertips brushed the seam. "Left-handed stitches," she murmured, "and not done in haste. Are you suggesting Mrs. Duval repaired it herself?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Instead, she looked around at the churchyard, at the fog rolling between the graves, and at the faces of the villagers who lingered to watch. "My dear Inspector," she said finally, "if I've learned one thing in life, it's that people who hide things seldom choose convenient places. The churchyard offers two advantages, holiness and fear. Both discourage curiosity." Craddock frowned. "You mean someone wanted it found, but not by just anyone?" "Precisely," she said, straightening. "And whoever left it here did so for me. By noon?" The scarf lay across Miss Marple's dining table, gleaming like treasure. Mrs. Duval, Lydia, as she had finally confessed, sat nearby, pale and trembling, a cup of untouched tea cooling between her fingers. "I swear I didn't put it there," she said. "I thought it was gone forever." Miss Marple studied her kindly. "Sometimes, my dear, the things we wish gone have a habit of returning at the worst possible moment." "I was frightened," Lydia whispered. "After that man came to your house, Rook, I wanted to disappear. I thought if I left quietly, it would all fade." "Criminals rarely fade," Miss Marple replied gently. "They have egos like weeds. They always grow back through cracks." Lydia's voice trembled. "Then why bring it back? Why here?" Miss Marple tapped the scarf lightly. "Because whoever placed it meant to send a message, not to you, but to me. A challenge, perhaps, or an invitation." She unrolled the scarf fully, her eyes moving across the intricate design. The golden loops were not random. They formed a rhythm, like words written in a foreign tongue. She traced them with a knitting needle. "See here, Lydia, this pattern of double twists and this sequence of small knots. It's almost musical." Lydia stared, bewildered. "I only ever saw him, Victor, tie it once, before he hid the brooch inside." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then I suspect the person who brought it back knows where that brooch still is." Fog thickened again, rolling over the cottages like smoke from a dying fire. Miss Marple was expecting no callers that evening, yet just as the clock struck 7, the garden gate creaked. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Lydia froze. "It's them," she whispered. "They've come back." Miss Marple rose calmly, moved to the window, and parted the curtain. The figure approaching was tall, coat collar up, hat pulled low. When he reached the porch light, the face beneath the brim became clear, tired, wary, but not cruel. "Mr. Reed," Miss Marple said, opening the door. "I had an inkling you would reappear, too." The insurance agent stepped inside, his breath silver in the chill air. "Inspector Craddock told me the scarf turned up. I had to see it with my own eyes." "They're very fine eyes," Miss Marple said dryly. "Though I wonder whether you're seeing the scarf or what it conceals." Reed hesitated. "I came to warn you. There's more at stake than jewels. That brooch wasn't just valuable. It carried something else, something written in microscript on the clasp. Names, Miss Marple. Names of men who've been moving stolen art across Europe. Lydia gasped. Then Victor wasn't just a thief? He was a courier, Reed said. A dangerous one. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And someone in St. Mary Mead, I suppose, was his English contact. That's my suspicion, Reed said grimly. Someone here knew exactly when the scarf would resurface, and where. He glanced toward the table, then stopped short. Good heavens! That tear, it's been stitched. Yes, Miss Marple said, and not recently. This was done last night. Then whoever had it had access to a sewing room, or a seamstress, Miss Marple said, her gaze flicking almost imperceptibly toward the window, the one that looked out onto the lane where Iris Bellamy's little tailor shop sat, its sign swaying softly in the wind the next morning. Miss Marple took the scarf and walked through the village with a purpose that startled the postman and puzzled the grocer. She entered Iris Bellamy's shop just as the girl was sweeping the floor. Iris looked up, smiling, but her expression faltered when she saw what Miss Marple carried. "Oh," Iris said softly, "you found it." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Or rather, it found me." She laid the scarf on the counter. "Beautiful workmanship, don't you think? The mending especially. Such delicate left-handed work. Yours, perhaps?" Iris's broom slipped from her fingers. "Miss Marple, I can explain—" "No need," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You did not steal it, my dear, but someone made you repair it." Tears sprang to Iris's eyes. "He said it was for a customer. He came last night after dark, said he'd pay double if I had it done by morning. He wore gloves, and his voice," she shivered, "cold, like metal. Did he give a name?" She shook her head. "Only said to leave the finished scarf at the church gate before sunrise." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet satisfaction. "Then we have our man, or at least his shadow." That evening, under the lamplight, Miss Marple examined the scarf once more. Her fingers traced the mended seam, pausing at a single uneven knot, slightly thicker than the others. She tugged it gently, and a tiny object slipped free, a pearl clasp, no bigger than a thimble, engraved with a single letter, R. She smiled. "Oh, my dear Reed," she murmured, "so you weren't just watching the thieves. You were playing among them." Outside, the church bell tolled 9, and Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the golden scarf gleaming before her like a net spun from truth and deception. Somewhere beyond the lane, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate. Heading toward her gate, she looked up, serene and ready. "Well," she said softly, reaching for her knitting needles, "it seems the next act of our little play is about to begin." Chapter 5. Murder on the Green. Morning came sharp as a pin. The mist peeled back from St. Mary Mead like torn muslin. By 10 o'clock the village green had found its cheer, a cricket match arranged in indecent haste, trestled tables sagging with sponge cakes and pride, bunting snapping above heads that pretended. Nothing dreadful had ever happened within. Earshot of the church bell, Miss Marple took her place on a wicker chair, set slightly, apart an excellent position for counting cakes and suspects. Lydia Duval, shawl pinned firmly, sat beside her, pale but composed. Inspector Craddock, in shirt-sleeves and vigilance, pretended to watch cricket. And near the lemonade urn stood Mr. Alistair Reed, his agreeable face polished to innocence, chatting with Mrs. Price Ridley, as if innocence were a raffle prize one could win with the correct smile. On the table between Miss Marple and Lydia lay a folded square of linen. Inside, carefully wrapped, was the golden scarf returned, repaired, and humming with peril like a musical note no one else could hear. Miss Marple had brought it because murderers are moths. They come reliably to dangerous silk. Do you think it wise? Lydia murmured. My dear, Miss Marple said, the unwise thing is pretending wickedness doesn't exist. I prefer to lay tea for it and mind the teaspoons. The match began. Bats cracked. Applause fluttered. Iris Bellamy flitted between tables with a tray of biscuits and nerves. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, fussed about bylaws. The vicar beamed industriously at nothing in particular. And through it all, Miss Marple watched the way eyes moved what they sought, what they refused to see. A small commotion rose by the lemonade. Mrs. Price Ridley had caught Mr. Reed adding a suspiciously generous splash from a silver hip flask. He bowed, charming, and offered it to the vicar as an antiseptic against chill. Laughter fizzed. The flask vanished. Craddock's mouth tightened. Observe, Miss Marple said mildly. Mr. Reed does not like to be unarmed. Unarmed? Lydia echoed, puzzled. Hospitality is a weapon if you know how to pour it. A shout from the cricket pitch made heads swing. Alan Rookout, on bail, to Craddock's simmering disgust, had stationed himself at the boundary rope. He had that professional swagger men wear when the law is close but not close enough. Iris, passing him with the biscuit tray, flinched. He said something low that made her fingers rattle the cups. Craddock began to rise. Miss Marple's hand touched his sleeve, just a feather's weight. Not yet, she murmured. He is bait today, not hook. Rook smirked, tipped an invisible hat toward Lydia, and sauntered off toward the beech tree at the far side of the green, where the bunting fell into a strip of shade and gossip had to bend its head to pass. Mr. Reed's eyes followed him with the friendly interest of a man measuring. Another man's wallet, Dot, and then because villages love a scene the way flowers love sun. Mrs. Price Ridley exclaimed, My brooch! She clapped a hand to her throat. My little swallow gone? Heads turned. Hands flew to collars. Suspicion scuttled like a beetle. Craddock sighed as if the day had personally insulted him. I'll take details later, madam. Stay by the urn, if you please, and stop her boiling it. While he soothed, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the beech shade. Iris had slipped there, tray abandoned, her face white as paper. Rook stood too close, his head cocked like a listening dog's, his palm against the tree above her shoulder, not touching, but closing the space. Miss Marple rose neatly like a needle coming out of cloth. Go on, Inspector, she said. Ask Mr. Reed to tell you a story about micro-writing and brooch. Men who enjoy stories occasionally misplace the endings. She crossed the grass with the gentle determination of weather. Halfway there, a sudden cheer went up. Someone had struck a boundary. The bat's crack rolled over the green, and for a moment everyone looked away. It is in those moments that evil does its tidy work. A cry tore the shade. Iris stumbled out, tripping on the boundary rope, one hand at her throat, the other clawing at air. For a heartbeat the world hesitated, and then she pitched forward, face first into the short, immaculate grass. The tray went with her in a scatter of china and shock. People ran. People froze. People decided to see or chose not to dot. Miss Marple knelt first. Iris's eyes were wide and empty, her lips parted, a single thread of pale froth at the corner of her mouth. Around her throat, tight and obscene against soft skin, was the golden scarf. Its gilt threads winked in the sun as if they enjoyed their work. "Oh," Miss Marple said softly, and unpinned the silk with a movement tender as a mother. "Oh, my dear." Craddock thundered up, already barking orders. "Stand back. Mr. Haydock, doctor. Reed, hold that rope, no one in or out. Rook, if you move, I didn't touch her," Rook snapped, but his voice had lost its swagger and found a frayed edge. She started gasping. She did it to herself. To herself, Miss Marple repeated, and her tone turned the words over like stones. Beneath them, something ugly wriggled. Dr. Haydock shouldered through, went brisk and quiet, then looked grim. "Gone," he said softly to Craddock, quick as a snuffed match. "Constriction marks? But look, these petechia. There's more. I'll need to open her up to be sure, but I'd wager poison helped the scarf along." "Poison?" Craddock stared. "At a village cricket match?" Dr. Haydock's eyes slid to the lemonade dot Mrs. Price Ridley. Overhearing, let out a sepulchral "Oh," and seized the urn with heroic self-sacrifice, tipping its contents into the grass. "For the good of all." "Madam," Craddock said hollowly, "you will write down exactly who drank what and who gave it to them, with times." Rook stood stiff as a scarecrow. Anger shuddered behind calculation. Mr. Reed held the boundary rope obediently, face pale, eyes doing arithmetic. Lydia swayed. Miss Marple guided her to the wicker chair that had become horribly spare. "Why, Iris?" Lydia's voice was a torn whisper. "She was only kind." "Kindness," Miss Marple said, "is often in the way." Craddock crouched. "Miss Marple, for pity's sake, if you saw anything—" "I saw many things," she said, and folded the golden scarf, careful not to disturb the knot where it had bitten Iris's neck. "But tell me first, who handled this scarf today?" "Apart from me, Lydia, and Iris." Craddock scrubbed a hand over his face. "You showed it to Reed briefly. The vicar admired it at a distance, claimed it would make an excellent harvest festival ribbon, to which Mrs. Price Ridley objected on theological grounds. Rook sneered at it from across the green. And you, I think, tucked it away again." "I did," Miss Marple said. "Before the lemonade incident." "What lemonade incident?" Craddock demanded. "Mr. Reed and his flask," Miss Marple murmured. "It created useful confusion." Reed colored, offended. "Purely cordial, I assure you. And if you're quite finished maligning my picnicking habits, Inspector, is there any reason I'm still needed at this rope?" "Yes," Craddock said. "It becomes you." Reed's mouth tightened. His gloved hand flexed on the rope. The glove caught sunlight. Not glove leather finer, kid-skin. New dot Miss Marple's eyes went once to Reed's hand, once to the scarf, and then to the beech shade, the patch of ground where Iris had fallen. She rose, crossed to it, and knelt again, not over Iris this time, but over the flattened grass. A faint scuff marred the soil, half-moon-shaped, the mark of a heel. Close to it, glittering almost invisibly, lay a crystal bead. "From a lady's hat," she said, picking it up on the point of a hat-pin. "No too small. A tassel end, or a rosary." She walked the bead to Craddock like a communion wafer. He squinted. What the devil do I do with this? Think, Miss Marple said. Who here today wears beads to the green? Not Mrs. Price Ridley, she wears righteousness. Not the vicar's wife, she would snag them on good intentions. Someone quieter, someone we do not look at because she always looks at us. Across the green, Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper from Maple Lodge, stood very still, her hands folded, her eyes demurely lowered. Her hat was plain. Her gloves were not, pale dove-gray, with tiny round beads sewn along the wrist. One bead missing, leaving a naked stitch. Maple Lodge, Miss Marple murmured, where our midnight was spent 2 nights ago when a lantern moved behind drawn curtains, where Victor Larocque once visited the niece engaged there, where a maid left suddenly, and no one mentioned her again, because the salary was paid twice over. Inspector asked Mrs. Weatherby to show you her gloves. Craddock's brows shot up. On what grounds? On the grounds that Iris was strangled with a scarf whose knots were left-handed, and Mrs. Weatherby is left-handed. She carries her market basket on the right to keep her strong hand free for her latchkey. She told me so, which means she didn't mean to tell me. And because beads do not fling themselves. Craddock went. Mrs. Weatherby looked up as he approached, and in that single second Miss Marple saw it, the collapse of a mask, the dreadful relaxation of someone done with pretending. She held out her hands before he asked. The dove-gray gloves trembled. On the right glove along the wrist, threads stuck out where a bead should have been. Where is the rest of the rosary? Craddock asked gently. Mrs. Weatherby's lips moved once before sound arrived. Gone, she said, like forgiveness. She did not run. She did not deny. She merely looked past Craddock, over heads beyond bunting, to a future that had narrowed to the width of a gallows step. He told me, she said in a low, flat voice, that the scarf would only frighten her, that a little pressure makes people reasonable. He promised me Maple Lodge. He promised me everything if I would only help him. And then he laughed. Victor, Lydia breathed. Mrs. Weatherby flinched. Not him. The other. The one with the clean hands and the eyes that count. Her voice failed. She looked at Mr. Reed. It was not a dramatic pointing. It was worse, a tired glance of a woman who has learned at last that all her small economies were spent on the wrong man. Reed smiled, polished as ever, and lifted his palms. Really, madam. Craddock pivoted toward him. The green held its breath. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. Not yet, she said, and her voice was taut as the scarf had been ready to bite. We must count properly. Poison first. She stepped to the lemonade urn's damp grave. Doctor, could a contact poison be threaded into silk? Something that would not act at once? Haydock frowned. Absorbed through the skin? Certainly. Some alkaloids will do it in minutes. Miss Marple nodded. Then the scarf did not kill alone. It delivered. Mrs. Weatherby, who told you how to tie those knots. The housekeeper's eyes filled with a terrible, humble gratitude, as if someone had finally asked the right question. Miss, she whispered, I didn't know the knots mattered. He showed me. He took my hands and showed me how to pull left over right, then left again to set it. He said it was safer for a woman's strength. Of course he did, Miss Marple murmured, and looked up at Reed, at his kid gloves, his tidy patience, his steady orbit of whatever shone. Men who sell safety often sell coffins. Reed spread his hands wider, appealing to the crowd with his charm like a chore boy offering a hymn. "Inspector, this is farcical. The lady is in shock. I am here. I have been here most conspicuously. Ask anyone." "I will," Craddock said. "And I'll ask where your flask is." Reed's smile flickered. "Confiscated by public morality." "Then I suppose morality will submit it to the yard," Craddock replied. A wind lifted the bunting. It slapped the air like a warning. Miss Marple, still and small and unyielding, placed the folded golden scarf back into its linen as one puts a dangerous relic to sleep. A hush sloped over the green, the kind that makes even birds rethink singing. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you have a murder on your hands that looks like panic but smells like planning. Secure Mrs. Weatherby with kindness, not cuffs. She has been used. Keep Mr. Reed exactly where he is and exactly how he hates it, waiting. And for heaven's sake, have someone fetch the vicar. We are going to need a list of who drank lemonade, who touched silk, and who will find themselves suddenly parched when you ask." Craddock exhaled irritation. Respect, grief, all muddled like the dregs in a cup. "Very good," he said. "And you?" Miss Marple looked toward Maple Lodge, where the afternoon sun lay thin as old gold on shuttered windows. Somewhere inside that house she felt a drawer waited with its mouth slightly open, like a secret too eager to stay kept. "I," she said, with a brightness that was not cheer, "am going to pay a call. There's a particular kind of sewing box that housekeepers favor, Inspector. It has a false bottom, and false bottoms are where people put truths they cannot live with on a shelf." She slipped the linen parcel into her basket. The scarf's weight seemed lighter now, or perhaps she had grown used to the gravity it brought. "What if he follows you?" Lydia asked, eyes flicking to Reed. "My dear," Miss Marple said, and even Reed looked away. "Let him try. I've been followed by worse than clean shoes and clever talk." She set off across the green small, as a sparrow and twice as certain as behind her the village began its ancient, necessary work, the taking of statements, the pouring of tea, the counting of beads, the counting of lies. And high above, the bunting fluttered on, a bright, foolish banner over a battlefield no one beyond St. Mary Mead would ever see save those who understood that evil prefers a pretty day. The church clock struck 3, clear as water. Miss Marple did not look back. She walked toward Maple Lodge and the shadow waiting in its hall, carrying in her basket a length of gold that had begun to look, under English sun, very much like a noose. Chapter 6. A curious pattern of knots. The afternoon sun fell weakly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, tracing pale webs of light on her polished floorboards. Outside, the world of St. Mary Mead seemed deceptively tranquil once more. Milk bottles clanking, postmen whistling, gossip fluttering like clothes on the line. But inside the cottage, on a square of white linen, lay the golden scarf, gleaming and silent, as though it were listening. Miss Marple sat before it with her knitting abandoned, her eyes sharper than any needle. She had seen 1,000 patterns in her long life, crochet, lace, embroidery, deceit. But never had she seen one quite like this, a pattern made not of thread alone, but of secrets knotted into silk. Each knot told a story, and this one, she suspected, told of murder. Inspector Craddock arrived just after tea, looking rumpled and irritable. "I've had Reed's flask tested," he said without preamble. "Traces of atropine. Not enough to kill a horse, but more than enough to stop a heart if taken with spirits. And Mrs. Weatherby confirms he gave her the formula for the so-called perfume oil she used on the scarf. That's what burned the girl's throat. Clever, devilish stuff." Miss Marple didn't look up. "Cleverness, Inspector, is very rarely respectable. Sit down and do stop pacing. You'll make the rug nervous." Craddock grunted and did as told. "So what are we looking at now? You said you'd found something in the pattern?" "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, leaning closer to the shimmering gold threads. "At first I thought these knots were decorative. But look closely, my dear. See how they alternate? 3 small, 2 large, then a single twist, like a code or rhythm." Craddock bent over it. "You mean letters?" "Not exactly. More like coordinates. I believe someone used the weave to mark locations." She touched one knot with a thin knitting needle. "This one here, slightly darker. It's made of a different thread altogether. Brass, not gold. And there a faint red stain. Blood, I think, from when it was first used to strangle." Craddock swallowed hard. "You've got the stomach of a sergeant major." "Not at all," Miss Marple said serenely. "Just experience. Death has a habit of being dreadfully repetitive." Their discussion was interrupted by a knock, gentle, hesitant. The vicar entered, hat in hand, eyes troubled. "Miss Marple, Inspector, forgive me, but I thought you should know. Someone broke into the church vestry last night." "Broke in?" Craddock barked. "What was taken?" The vicar hesitated. "Nothing. At least, nothing of value. But they cut the lock on the cabinet where the jumble sale donations were kept. The odd thing is they didn't take anything. They just moved things about. Tidied them, almost." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah, then our culprit was searching for something he left behind." Craddock frowned. "Or checking that it was still there." The vicar nodded nervously. "There was one more thing. I found this on the floor." From his pocket he produced a small paper spool of golden thread. The exact shade of the scarf. Miss Marple took it delicately, her face unreadable. "Thank you, Reverend. You've just confirmed a rather uncomfortable suspicion of mine." Craddock leaned forward. "Which is?" "That our murderer," she said quietly, "is still at work, and that the pattern on this scarf leads not to an object, but to a person. That night, while the rest of St. Mary Mead slept under its blanket of calm deceit, Miss Marple sat alone with the scarf spread across her desk. She lit her small lamp and began counting the knots aloud, her voice steady and almost tender. 3, 2, 1. Then another sequence. 5, 2, 3. She jotted each set in her notebook. The pattern was deliberate, rhythmic, but not mathematical. It followed the irregularity of human movement, not numbers. Then, with a sudden spark of understanding, she realized what it was. A map. The loops mirrored the outline of St. Mary Mead, the curves, the lines, the irregularity of its lanes and cottages. And the final knot, a deep twist of brass thread, sat exactly where one place would fall on that mental map, Maple Lodge. Miss Marple's lips curved in satisfaction. "So," she murmured, "we returned to where we began." By dawn, the mist had rolled back again, thick and deliberate as a curtain. Miss Marple wrapped the scarf carefully and walked to Maple Lodge. her sensible shoes making soft thuds on the damp earth. The house stood gloomy and grand, its windows shuttered, its gate half open like an invitation too polite to trust Dot inside. Mrs. Weatherby's belongings had already been boxed for removal. Dust sheets lay across the furniture like shrouds, yet the air felt disturbed. Something had been moved recently. Miss Marple went straight to the drawing-room. There, beside the hearth, stood a sewing table. She remembered what she'd told Craddock. False bottoms are where people put truths they cannot live with. Her fingers traced the wood, then pressed lightly against one corner. It gave way with a faint click. Inside, beneath a stack of lace handkerchiefs, lay a small velvet pouch. Dot. She opened it and gasped. Dot inside was another piece of silk, a fragment of the golden scarf, cut neatly from one edge. But this one had a new pattern of knots, different from the original. These knots were smaller, tighter, like an unfinished message, and on the last loop, barely visible, hung a small charm, a monogrammed cufflink with the initials A.R. Miss Marple's expression softened. "Oh, Mr. Reed," she whispered. "You clever, greedy boy." When Inspector Craddock arrived an hour later, Miss Marple had tea waiting and the cufflink glinting on her saucer. She explained everything: the false compartment, the second piece of scarf, the matching thread from the vestry. "It was Reed all along," she said. "He planted evidence, framed the housekeeper, and nearly escaped clean. But he was too vain. The cufflink gives him away. The man who thinks of everything always forgets something small." Craddock's eyes widened. "He's still in the village?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said calmly. "He came to thank me this morning. He'll be back soon enough. Greedy men always return for trophies." As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door. "Good morning," came that smooth, rehearsed voice. "Miss Marple, I wanted to see how our little puzzle is progressing." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, it's nearly finished, Mr. Reed. Would you like to see the final pattern?" She laid the scarf on the table. Reed's eyes flickered. Recognition, then panic, masked by charm. My, restored it beautifully." "Not I," said Miss Marple, "but you. I believe you mended it the first time, to hide your own message in the knots. Your initials, perhaps A.R. Reed froze. Craddock stepped forward from the shadows of the parlor doorway. "Mr. Reed," he said evenly, "I believe you dropped something at Maple Lodge." For the first time, Reed's mask slipped. The gentleman vanished, and what remained was cold and feral. "You'll never prove it," he hissed. Dot. Miss Marple looked up at him, her expression gentle, almost pitying. "My dear, one doesn't need to prove what is already known. The truth, like a well-tied knot, never truly comes undone." By evening, Reed was in custody, and peace, or its imitation, had returned to St. Mary. Miss Marple sat by her window once more, the scarf now sealed in an evidence box. Yet she couldn't resist one last look. She smiled as she recalled the curious pattern, a series of knots that, when read correctly, spelled not names or numbers, but a single word, repeated again and again between loops. Mine. The scarf, it seemed, had always told the truth. The greed, the possession, the claim of one man over what was never his to keep: gold, secrets, or lives. Miss Marple sighed and returned to her knitting. "So many knots," she murmured. "And yet the simplest thread is honesty. Pity how few ever use it." Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead began to toll. The mist lifted at last, and somewhere on the quiet green where murder had once walked, the first light of redemption touched the grass. Chapter 7. Miss Marple Takes an Interest. It was 3 days since Alistair Reed had been taken away from St. Merry Mead, his polished shoes clinking against the cobblestones like punctuation marks in a confession. The village, naturally, had not recovered. Mrs. Price Ridley claimed she hadn't slept since the poisoned scarf scandal, though her maid reported otherwise. The vicar's wife organized a prayer circle for moral restoration, which nobody attended, and Miss Hartnell began locking her tea caddy, convinced arsenic had become fashionable. As for Miss Marple, she was doing what she always did after a murder, watering her roses and waiting for the next truth to blossom. But even as she pinched a wilted bud, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the affair of the golden scarf had been left untied. Reed had been clever, yes, but not clever enough to have orchestrated every strand alone. There had been too many coincidences, too much precision. Someone else had been playing the same game, and Miss Marple intended to find out who it was just past noon, when the knock came up a light, measured tapping that carried neither fear nor guilt, but something far more interesting, calculation. "Come in," Miss Marple called. Setting aside her watering can, the door opened to reveal Lydia Duval, the lady once known as the woman in lavender. She looked composed now, dressed in black silk, her beauty muted but not diminished. Only her eyes betrayed her, restless, shadowed, and unwilling to meet Miss Marple's gaze for long. "Miss Marple," she began softly, "I wanted to thank you for everything. The police say my name is clear. They say it's over." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Over is such a comforting word, isn't it? People use it to stop thinking. But you and I, my dear, know the world doesn't tidy itself that easily." Lydia froze. I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with practiced calm. "Sugar?" Lydia shook her head, fingers twisting her gloves. "You think I'm hiding something." "Not hiding, perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Merely keeping silent about things that are inconvenient. For instance, about your late husband." Lydia's composure cracked. "Henry was a good man." "I dare say he was. Until he wasn't. You see, I've been thinking about those knots on the golden scarf. They told a story of greed, yes, but also of collaboration. Each knot had 2 distinct hands. The first made by Reed, but the second, smaller, finer, almost feminine, was added later. And I do believe they were yours." Lydia's lips parted in disbelief. "Mine? You can't mean—" "Oh, I can," Miss Marple said gently. "You helped him. At first perhaps unwillingly, perhaps even in fear, but you helped nonetheless. You mended the scarf, hid the brooch, and played the frightened victim because you knew exactly what kind of sympathy that would buy." Lydia stood abruptly, her face pale as the china cup beside her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I had no choice. Victor would have killed me." Miss Marple nodded, unfazed. "Yes, my dear. But you continued helping long after Victor was dead. That's what interests me." Just then Inspector Craddock entered, hat in hand. "Sorry to intrude, Miss Marple, but you were right again." "Oh, dear," Miss Marple sighed. "That always means trouble." Craddock laid a small photograph on the table. "Found this in Reed's lodgings in London. taken 2 years ago in Nice. Read Victor Larocque and Lydia Duval." Miss Marple finished softly. Lydia's hands trembled. "That was before everything. Before the theft, before Victor went mad, and before you realized Reed wanted Victor dead," Miss Marple said. "You were the link between them, the go-between. You lured Victor into the partnership, and when it soured you watched as Reed eliminated him. But you kept the scarf. You kept the secret. And you made sure the code remained half-finished, so Reed would always need you to complete it." Craddock frowned. "You're saying she was in on it all along?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not entirely. People seldom begin as villains, Inspector. She began as a frightened woman. But fear, when fed on greed, grows teeth." Lydia sank into the chair, tears glistening. "He'd promised me safety," she whispered. "He said if I helped him we could start over. He used me, then left me with the evidence. I wanted to destroy the scarf, but I couldn't. I thought if it remained, so would my leverage." "Leverage," Miss Marple echoed softly. "Such an ugly word for a lady who once wore lavender." The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a sparrow hopped across the window ledge, pecking idly at invisible crumbs. Craddock broke the silence. "We'll have to take her in, Miss Marple." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "but not for murder." Her hands didn't tighten that scarf around poor Iris's neck. Her guilt lies in omission, and perhaps cowardice, not cruelty. Craddock nodded reluctantly. "I'll speak with the magistrate." After he left, Lydia turned to Miss Marple with desperate eyes. "Will they hang me?" Miss Marple reached for her teacup, her movements unhurried. "No, my dear. The rope is for those who pull it willingly. You merely held the end of it." Lydia burst into quiet sobs, and Miss Marple let her cry. Justice, she had learned long ago, did not always require the gallows. Sometimes it required only truth and the courage to bear it. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched. The scarf, sealed now in an evidence envelope, lay on the mantelpiece. Catching the faint light of the hearth dot, she thought of all the hands that had touched it. Reed's cunning, Lydia's trembling, Iris's doomed innocence, and of how something so beautiful could carry so much ruin. The pattern of knots had fascinated her. Yes, but what fascinated her more was the human pattern beneath it. How fear knotted with greed, how love tied itself to lies, and how truth, in the end, always found its thread dot as the church clock struck 9. She rose and poured herself a small sherry. "Really," she murmured to herself, "one mustn't underestimate the educational value of embroidery." Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that promised she was far from finished. For Miss Marple, a case was never truly closed. It merely changed form, like a thread waiting for the next knot to be tied. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Inspector Craddock. Inside was a note and a single line written in his scrawling hand. Case concluded. Reed confessed in full. Lydia's testimony helped. She'll be released under protection. You were right again, as always. Beneath it, folded neatly, was the golden scarf, its threads dull now, its power gone. Miss Marple smiled, tucked it away in her sewing basket, and whispered, "You've caused quite enough trouble, my dear. Best you stay where you belong, among needles and lessons." Outside, the roses nodded gently in the wind, as if agreeing that some things, no matter how golden, are better left forgotten. And in the little village of St. Mary Mead, peace returned once more, at least until the next whisper of trouble found its way to Miss Marple's teacup. Chapter 8. The Widow's Secret Drawer. The sun had barely risen above the hedgerows when Miss Marple's telephone rang, a sound so abrupt, so utterly un-English at such an hour, that she knew before answering it that trouble had returned to St. Mary Mead. "Miss Marple speaking," she said calmly, as though murders were as common as Morning Post. "Craddock here," came the inspector's gruff voice. "You'd best come at once. Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper at Maple Lodge, has been found dead." Miss Marple didn't gasp. She simply set down her teacup. "And where, Inspector, was she found?" "In her sitting-room, locked from the inside." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Then I should think the key will be somewhere very inconvenient." She hung up, fetched her hat and sensible shoes, and within half an hour was walking briskly toward Maple Lodge. The house looked just as it had the day Reed was taken away, still, silent, and heavy with unspoken memory. A thin mist clung to the hedges, making everything glisten faintly, as though the morning itself were holding its breath. Inside, Mrs. Weatherby lay slumped in her chair by the window, a half-knitted sock dangling from her needles. Her spectacles had slid to one side, and a cup of tea sat beside her, untouched, but still warm. "Peaceful, isn't it?" muttered Inspector Craddock grimly. "Doctor says heart failure. I don't like it." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Neither do the first. People rarely die tidily after murder has already visited their drawing-room." Craddock sighed. "We found no sign of forced entry. Door locked, window latched, nothing disturbed." Miss Marple moved closer to the table, her sharp eyes sweeping over every detail. "A tidy death," she said, "is often a messy truth in disguise." She picked up the knitting, ran her fingers along the wool, then smiled faintly. "The sock is wrong. She purled instead of knitted in this row. Mrs. Weatherby was meticulous. That mistake tells me something frightened her mid-stitch." Craddock blinked. "Frightened her? By what?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted to a small writing desk in the corner. "Perhaps," she said, "by what she saw or by what she was about to reveal." With Craddock's permission, Miss Marple examined the desk. It was small, mahogany, and far too polished for a housekeeper's station. She tried each drawer, ink pens, account books, letters, but the bottom one refused to budge. It was locked. Craddock frowned. "We'll have to force it." "Oh, dear me, no," Miss Marple said primly, producing a tiny hairpin from her sleeve. "One learns a few things from mending locks on knitting baskets." With a gentle twist, the drawer clicked open. Inside lay a shallow compartment lined with faded velvet. It contained only 3 things: a faded photograph, a small silver key, and a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and soft at the edges. Craddock leaned over her shoulder. "Well, I'll be what's this?" Miss Marple lifted the paper carefully. Written in a shaky but deliberate hand were the words, "If I die suddenly." "Look in the drawer beneath the sewing table." They exchanged a glance. Moments later, Craddock had pulled open the small sewing table beside the chair. Hidden beneath a false panel lay another drawer, this one deeper, rougher, and packed tightly with envelopes. Each was labeled in Mrs. Weatherby's neat, looping hand. "Letters," Craddock said, riffling through them, "all addressed to Victor Larocque." and good Lord to Alistair Reed. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I believe we've found the strings that held this entire dreadful tapestry together. One by one, the letters revealed their secrets. Mrs. Weatherby had not been merely a servant at Maple Lodge. Years earlier, she had been Victor LaHoque's mistress, and later, his confessor, his blackmailer, and his spy. She knew of the smuggling, of the coded scarf, of the brooch that held the list of names. And when Victor died, she inherited his sins. She's been collecting hush money," Craddock said, jaw tightening. "From Reed and maybe others." Miss Marple nodded. "But blackmailers, my dear Inspector, always overestimate their cleverness. They forget that their lives depend entirely on silence, and silence can be bought only for so long." She unfolded the photograph found in the drawer. It showed 4 people: Victor, Reed, Lydia Duval, and one more face that made her heart quicken, a familiar one. "Good heavens," she whispered. "That's Mrs. Weatherby herself. And behind her, look carefully, Inspector." Craddock squinted. "Is that the vicar's wife?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Yes, and now, I dare say, things are about to become quite interesting." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife greeted her with her usual bright smile, though her hands trembled as she poured the tea. "My dear Jane," she said, "what an awful business about poor Mrs. Weatherby. Heart failure, they say." Miss Marple stirred her cup slowly. "So convenient, isn't it? I often think the Almighty is given far too much credit for human handiwork." Mrs. Clement's smile faltered. "I am not sure what you mean." Miss Marple's tone remained polite, but her words were sharp as glass. "You knew Victor LaRoque. You met him in Nice the summer your husband attended that theological conference. You and Mrs. Weatherby traveled together, didn't you?" The color drained from Mrs. Clement's face. "That was years ago." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but memories, like debts, have a way of collecting interest. You corresponded with him afterward, letters Mrs. Weatherby kept. She used them to ensure your silence." Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled against its saucer. "She said she would ruin my husband, that she would tell everyone She stopped, unable to finish. Miss Marple's expression softened. "Affection is not a crime, my dear, but deceit often leads to darker things. Tell me, did you visit Maple Lodge last night?" Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "Yes, I went to beg her to destroy the letters. She laughed at me, said she had made copies. She turned away to fetch them, and I only touched her arm to make her listen. She fell, her head struck the corner of the table. I swear I didn't mean to." Miss Marple sighed, gently setting down her cup. "No, my dear, I believe you. You're not the sort who kills by design. But I fear the world will not see it that way." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, Mrs. Clement had composed herself. She confessed quietly, with dignity and despair. She wasn't poisoned or strangled, Craddock said later. A simple fall. "You were right, of course." Again, Miss Marple looked out the window at the fading evening light. "I take no pleasure in being right, Inspector. Truth, when found, is often very untidy. What shall we do about the letters?" Craddock asked. "Burn them," Miss Marple said firmly. "The dead have done enough harm without being made to gossip from their graves." Craddock nodded, and together they watched as the papers curled into ash inside the vicarage hearth. the last remnants of a web spun from greed. Fear and love gone wrong. That night, back in her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a small cup of cocoa and opened her own writing desk. Inside, neatly folded beside her letters and knitting patterns, lay a small note written in her delicate script. When you have lived long enough, you learn that evil is not loud. It whispers. It writes letters. It hides in drawers. She smiled faintly, folded the note away, and locked the drawer. Outside, the wind swept softly through St. Mary Mead, rustling the hedges like a sigh. The village slept, believing the nightmare had passed, but Miss Marple knew better. Evil, like embroidery, was made of endless threads, and someone, somewhere, was always ready to tie the next knot. Chapter 9. Footprints by the Rose Garden. Dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with an almost deceptive tranquility. The sky was blushing pink, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and roses just beginning to unfurl. Miss Marple, wrapped in her faded shawl, stepped into her garden to collect the morning paper and stopped dead in her tracks. The roses were disturbed. The soil, which she had neatly raked the evening before, bore the unmistakable imprint of footsteps. They began at the gate, trailed past the lilac bush, and ended beneath her bedroom window. Curious, she murmured. Very curious indeed. She crouched, peering closer. The prints were deep, uneven, one heel pressing harder than the other. A limp, perhaps, or a man carrying weight. And they were fresh. The dew had not yet refilled the hollows. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. So, she whispered, we're not finished after all. 10 minutes later, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Inspector Craddock, coat collar turned up, looking unusually grim. Morning, Miss Marple. I thought I'd better tell you before the papers do. Reed's escaped. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Then those footprints are his. Craddock blinked. Footprints? In my garden, she said, gesturing delicately with her teacup. Under my window, no less. I should imagine he came calling in the night. How flattering. Good Lord, Craddock muttered, stepping past her. He followed her out into the garden, bent to examine the marks, and whistled softly. You're right. That's him, all right, the same uneven gait. Must have hurt his leg climbing the prison wall. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful, not frightened. I suspect he wanted something he left behind. The scarf, perhaps. Or a letter. Men like Mr. Reed always leave unfinished business, like untied shoelaces. Craddock frowned. We've already collected all the evidence. Except, Miss Marple said quietly, for what he hid. He knows I found the second piece of the scarf. What he doesn't know is that I found something else inside it. Craddock's head snapped up. What did you find? Miss Marple smiled faintly. A name, Inspector. Embroidered so faintly one could mistake it for a flaw in the weave. A name he would kill to keep buried. She turned toward the rose bush, where the scent was almost intoxicating. I believe he'll come again tonight, and when he does, we shall be ready for him. Craddock's hand went to his revolver. You mean to use yourself as bait? Oh, my dear man, Miss Marple said sweetly, I've been bait for wickedness since the day I learned to knit. Evil always mistakes kindness for weakness, and that, Inspector, is where it errs. The morning wind carried the perfume of the roses, mingled now with something colder, the scent of danger taking root once more in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead Dot. And as Miss Marple bent to trim a bloom, she smiled faintly to herself. The game, it seemed, was not over yet. Chapter 10. A telegram from London the morning began with thunder. Not the kind that rattled windows, but the low, rolling kind that warned of storms still gathering over the horizon. St. Mary Mead, that little corner of polite deceit and polished brass, seemed unusually hushed. Even the postman walked slower, his satchel heavy with news that no one yet knew they were waiting for. When he reached Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple was already at her gate, pruning the climbing roses. "Morning, Miss," he said, tipping his cap. "Got a wire for you from London." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "From London?" she echoed. Telegrams from London rarely brought good cheer. She took the yellow envelope, turning it over in her fingers before tearing it open with one decisive motion. The words inside were short, urgent, and enough to make even her steady heart quicken. Read escaped. Again. Suspect heading your way. Stop. Beware contact named R. Summers, Scotland Yard. Miss Marple read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Perkins," she said calmly, "and do keep to the road on your way back. The lanes are rather uncertain this morning." By noon, the promised storm had rolled in thick mist, curling through the hedgerows, swallowing the village whole. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, though the needles moved slower than usual. She wasn't counting stitches. She was listening to the rhythm of footsteps, to the creak of a gate, to the whisper of rain on glass. At precisely 1 o'clock, the latch on her front gate clicked. A man's silhouette emerged from the fog, tall and lean, carrying an umbrella he didn't use. His coat was London cut, his shoes city shined, and though his hat shadowed his eyes, Miss Marple saw the glint of something metal. Perhaps at his wrist. He knocked twice. "Come in," she called. Voice deceptively mild, the man entered with the air of someone accustomed to being welcome everywhere. "Miss Marple, I presume?" "My name is Raymond Summers." "Scotland Yard." Her blue eyes lifted to his face, smooth, pleasant, but wrong. It was too polished, too rehearsed. "Oh, how interesting," she said, motioning to the tea-tray. "I had a feeling London would send someone." "Milk and sugar, Mr. Summers?" "Neither, thank you." He sat opposite her, resting his gloved hands on his knees. "I'm here about Alistair Reed. We believe he may attempt to contact you." "May?" she said softly. "How very polite of him. In fact, he already has." Summers stiffened. "You've seen him?" "Not seen. Heard. Footsteps by my rose garden last night. Quite distinctive, one heel heavier than the other." The man's expression didn't change, but Miss Marple noticed the smallest movement, his right foot shifting subtly, the heel scraping the carpet. One shoe made less sound than the other. "Oh, dear," she murmured. "I do believe the Yard has sent me a rather poor imitation." The man's polite smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" "Begging won't help, Mr. Reed," Miss Marple said gently. "Or shall I still call you Summers? You were always fond of aliases, weren't you?" His eyes flashed. "You've made a mistake." "Oh, I really do," she said, setting down her cup. "You see, I know exactly what Scotland Yard telegrams look like: crisp, black ink, proper punctuation. Yours was printed on a cheaper stock, slightly gray at the edges. You forged it to gain entry. A clever attempt, but not clever enough. Reed stood abruptly, knocking his chair against the hearth. "Where is it?" he hissed. "The scarf. You think you can keep what's mine?" Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "The scarf is with Inspector Craddock. You'll find his company less forgiving than mine." He moved toward her, but she did not rise. "I should warn you," she said lightly. "I've taken precautions. The moment you entered my garden, the vicar's gardener went to fetch the police." Reed laughed harshly. "Bluff?" The sound of boots in the lane proved him wrong. Reed froze, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple looked almost sympathetic. "Oh, Mr. Reed, how unfortunate. You've been running from the truth for so long, but the truth, like tea, has a way of finding its warmth." He turned to flee through the back door, but the silhouette waiting there stopped him cold. Inspector Craddock stepped in, revolver raised. "Going somewhere, Reed?" For the first time, the man looked afraid. "I just wanted what's mine," he muttered. Craddock's voice was iron. "And what exactly is that?" Reed's eyes flicked toward Miss Marple. "The name. The one in the scarf. You've seen it, haven't you?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, Reginald Somers. Your partner, the real man from Scotland Yard. You killed him in London and took his identity. That was your final knot, wasn't it?" Reed's face twisted. "He betrayed me." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "You betrayed yourself." By evening, Reed was back in custody, silent and defeated. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, the real telegram from London now lying open on the table beside her. Craddock entered quietly. He confessed everything. Somers had been tracking him for months. Reed killed him the night before the first arrest. "I thought as much," Miss Marple said. "Ambition is a dreadful poison, Inspector. It seeps through the nicest suits." Craddock nodded toward the telegram. "You knew it was a forgery right away, didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "I suspected. The punctuation gave him away. Scotland Yard never abbreviates. Beware." He laughed softly. "Remind me never to send you a wire." "You wouldn't need to," she said, eyes twinkling. "I'd know what you meant before you said it." When he left, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The footprints from the night before had already faded beneath the rain. She knelt beside her roses, brushing a few petals aside in the soil. Half buried and glinting faintly, she found the corner of a torn telegram envelope. She smiled sadly. "Even the wicked leave litter." She folded it neatly, placed it in her apron pocket, and rose. The storm was over, but in the quiet fragrance of her roses, she could still feel the echo of deceit, faint and lingering. "Evil," she murmured. "Clipping a perfect bloom has such poor manners. It never knows when to stop calling." She carried the rose inside, set it in a crystal vase, and sat by her window, once more content, alert, and quietly waiting for the next whisper of trouble to drift through the calm of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 11. The missing button. Rain fell softly over St. Mary Mead that morning, the kind of steady drizzle that seemed designed for secrets. The village looked half erased, its hedges blurred into the mist, its roofs glistening like dark slate mirrors. Inside Dingmead Cottage, Miss Marple was not knitting, nor reading, nor gossiping. She was thinking. Alistair Reed was back in custody. The golden scarf had been sent to London for evidence. The papers called her the village sleuth who outsmarted a killer. But Miss Marple wasn't smiling. Something still bothered her, a small, nagging imperfection in the pattern. Murder, she always said, was like embroidery. If the stitch was uneven, it meant the design wasn't finished. And this particular pattern still had a loose thread dot at 9:30. Inspector Craddock appeared at her door, dripping from the rain and looking more exhausted than usual. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, hanging his hat on the peg. "I came to thank you again. Scotland Yard's all but singing hymns in your honor." She poured him tea. "I'm far too old for hymns, Inspector, but I'll settle for the truth." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think we've missed something?" "I know we have," she said quietly. "Tell me, when you arrested Reed, was he wearing the same coat as before?" Craddock frowned. "Now that you mention it, no. He'd changed into a dark navy one." "Why?" Miss Marple rose, moving to her desk where a small folded paper sat. "Because when he came to my house pretending to be Mr. Summers, he left this behind." She unfolded it, revealing a single button, dull with rain but distinctive deep navy, with a gold rim. "From a fine London tailor, I believe," she said. "But this is no ordinary button. It bears a crest." Craddock bent closer. "A lion and a crown. Government insignia." Miss Marple nodded. "From an officer's uniform. Reed was not only a thief, Inspector, he was impersonating an officer of the Crown." Craddock's eyes widened. "Good Lord, that explains how he moved so freely between London and the Riviera. He wasn't smuggling jewels, he was smuggling documents." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, settling back into her chair. "The scarf, the brooch, the letters, they were all distractions. The real crime was treason, wrapped neatly in silk and gold." Craddock stared at the button as though it might confess. "We'll trace the tailor, of course. If we can prove the uniform was forged—" "It wasn't forged," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "It was borrowed." He looked up sharply. "Borrowed? Barge?" "From the man whose name was hidden in the scarf," she said. "Reginald Summers, the real Scotland Yard officer Reed murdered. I believe Reed kept his uniform as a trophy. But after his escape, someone helped him retrieve it." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Someone in the village?" Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "My dear Inspector, evil rarely stays abroad when it can find comfort at home." She rose, crossing to the window. "There is one person who visited Reed after his first arrest, under the guise of delivering church donations. The vicar's wife." Craddock's voice was barely a whisper. "Mrs. Clement?" "But she confessed already to Weatherby's death." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and that confession was true but incomplete. She confessed to what she thought was her only sin. Yet guilt as a greedy companion. I believe Reed found her afterward. He threatened to expose her affair in Nice unless she helped him. She gave him money and freedom." Craddock stared at her, thunderstruck. "You think she aided his escape?" "I'm certain of it," Miss Marple said. "And this button proves it. The Vicar's Charity Sewing Circle mended uniforms for the War Memorial Display last week. I noticed a set missing this morning. Our widow's secret drawer wasn't the only one hiding things. That afternoon, rain still pouring." Miss Marple and Craddock stood in the vicarage study. Mrs. Clement sat before them, pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. "I only meant to help him leave the country," she said weakly. "He swore no one would be hurt." Craddock's voice was harsh. "He murdered 2 people, Mrs. Clement, and nearly a third." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I couldn't bear another scandal. My husband, his position, our life would have been ruined." Miss Marple's expression softened. "My dear, it's a dreadful thing, isn't it? Doing the wrong thing for the right reason. It always ends the same way, grief and rain." Mrs. Clement broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. Craddock turned away, his voice low. "We'll have to charge her as an accessory." "I know," Miss Marple said sadly. "But be gentle. Not all villains are wicked. Some are simply weak." Later, as dusk crept across the village, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the missing button glinting faintly in the LAMPLIGHT dot so many people. She thought, undone by such small things as scarf. A secret, a single button dot in the end. The world's greatest deceptions were never grand conspiracies, but little lies sewn neatly into everyday life. She placed the button in her sewing box, alongside a spool of gold thread, and whispered, "For remembrance." Outside the rain ceased. The night settled over St. Mary Mead, silent once more, though Miss Marple knew silence was only the pause between revelations. Somewhere another secret was waiting to be unbuttoned. Chapter 12. The Vicar's Unspoken. Fear the bells of St. Mary Mead tolled softly through the fog, each chime echoing like the slow beat of a troubled heart. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Clement sat at his desk, his hands clasped and trembling. A Bible lay open before him, but his eyes were fixed on nothing. The door creaked open. "May I come in?" Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet firm, carried the weight of inevitability. She stepped inside without waiting for an answer, her knitting bag looped neatly over her arm. "Of course, Miss Marple," the vicar murmured, his voice hoarse. "I rather thought you would." "You've been expecting me," she said softly, closing the door behind her. He gave a faint, weary smile. "One doesn't need divine revelation to predict that." Miss Marple took the chair opposite him, folding her hands primly over her bag. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and worry. "I understand," she began delicately, "that your wife has told the inspector everything." The vicar flinched. She told him what she believed to be true. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone quiet but cutting. "But not everything that you know." The vicar looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "You helped her, Reverend. You knew she had gone to Maple Lodge that night. You found her afterward, frightened and blood-stained, and instead of calling the police, you cleaned the evidence and told her to say nothing." The vicar's lips parted, but no words came. "How could you know that?" he whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You see, my dear, there are stains soap cannot remove, especially on conscience. You quoted from the book of Psalms this Sunday. 'Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow.' Only men wrestling with guilt ever choose that verse." He lowered his head, the facade of serenity cracking. "I thought I could protect her," he said finally. "She was terrified. And after everything she'd suffered, the blackmail, the shame, I couldn't bear to see her destroyed. So I burned her shawl. I buried the bloodied cloth beneath the rosebush by the vestry." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. Ah, that explains the disturbed soil I noticed 2 days ago. He looked up, startled. You saw that? I see everything that people believe no one will. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked between them like a metronome, marking the rhythm of their shared silence. I'm not proud of what I've done, the vicar said at last. A man of God should live in truth. But sometimes, Miss Marple, truth demands too heavy a price. Miss Marple's voice softened. My dear Reverend, truth always demands a price. The question is only who must pay it. He nodded slowly, the lines on his face deepening. When I buried that shawl, I prayed that the earth would keep it secret. But it seems even the ground cannot keep still when God wishes something unearthed. Quite right, she said. Evil rarely stays buried. It simply grows roots. He gave a weak laugh. I suppose you'll tell the inspector. Miss Marple tilted her head. No, I think I shall let you do that yourself. Redemption cannot be borrowed, Reverend. It must be earned. Before he could answer, there came a sudden knock at the door sharp, hurried. The vicar stiffened. Come in, he called. Inspector Craddock stepped inside, rain on his coat, urgency in his eyes. Miss Marple, Reverend, we've just received word from London. Reed's associates, the men he worked with, one of them has vanished from custody. Another was found dead at the docks. Poison. The vicar paled. You think the danger has reached here? I don't think, Craddock said grimly. I know. Someone wants to tie up loose ends, and St. Mary Mead has more than a few. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Then we must be quick, Inspector. Evil is most efficient when it believes the righteous are slow. Craddock gave her a look of mixed exasperation and respect. You've got an idea, haven't you? Just a suspicion, she said, eyes distant. And I suspect it's buried in the same garden that hides our Reverend's conscience. The vicar's voice trembled. You mean? Yes, Miss Marple said, turning toward the door. The rose bushes, Reverend. You buried more than a shawl that night. You buried the last piece of evidence that could tell us who Reed was truly working for. For a long moment the vicar said nothing. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he reached for his hat. If confession must be done, he said quietly, then let it be done properly. Miss Marple gave a small nod, her eyes kind but unyielding. That's the spirit, Reverend. Better to face the storm than pretend it's only rain. As they stepped out into the wet, gray morning, the church bell began to toll again, slow, solemn, unrelenting. It sounded less like a call to prayer and more like a summons for truth. And in that mournful sound, Miss Marple knew the final act of the golden scarf affair was about to unfold, and this time even the sanctity of the churchyard would not protect those who had sinned beneath its shadow. Chapter 13. Tea with the seamstress. There was a brittle chill in the air that afternoon, the kind that makes the village seem smaller, tighter, like a secret someone is desperate to keep. The fog had returned to St. Mary Mead, curling lazily around chimneys and fences, softening the edges of everything except truth. Miss Marple had decided that today, of all days, she must pay a visit to Iris, Bellamy, the village seamstress, whose quiet fingers had mended everything, from vicars' robes to scandal itself. But there was something about Iris that had always bothered Miss Marple. She had seen too much, known too many details, and yet always remained just out of reach, like a shadow that never quite fell where it should dot. So Miss Marple did what she always did best. She brought flowers and a very sharp mind to tea. The little shop on the high street smelled of lavender polish and thread dust. Spools of colored silk lined the shelves like soldiers on parade, and in the corner a single lamp burned low, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Iris Bellamy looked up from her sewing machine as Miss Marple entered, her smile automatic but her eyes wary. Miss Marple, what a lovely surprise. You've come about your handkerchiefs, I suppose. Oh, I've quite enough of those, my dear, Miss Marple said pleasantly, setting her flowers on the counter. No, I've come for a cup of tea, if you've one to spare. The girl hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Of course. I've just brewed a pot. She led Miss Marple into the back room, where a small table was laid with mismatched china and a plate of ginger biscuits. It was all very tidy, yet too tidy like a scene rehearsed. Such a comfortable little place you have, Miss Marple said, settling in. I've always thought seamstresses make the best detectives. You see things other people miss, patterns, mistakes, stray threads. Iris laughed nervously. I only see fabric, I'm afraid. Oh, but fabric is a most revealing thing, Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea. Especially golden silk. The cup in Iris's hands stopped mid-her. Miss Marple didn't look up. She simply went on, her voice calm and conversational. You were the one who mended the scarf, weren't you? After it was torn, such fine work too almost invisible. But there was one curious detail. You see, when you repaired the hem, you added 3 extra knots along the edge. Deliberate, I think. Iris swallowed hard. I don't know what you mean. Of course you do, my dear, Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but piercing. You weren't just repairing it, you were sending a message? Iris's hands trembled. Please, you don't understand. Oh, I understand very well, Miss Marple said softly. You were frightened. Reed had escaped. He wanted you to fix the scarf again to hide something new inside it. But you knew he wouldn't let you live afterward. So you left a message for anyone clever enough to see it. Tears filled Iris's eyes. He said if I didn't help him, he'd burn the shop, that he'd tell people I'd been part of it all. I only did what he asked that one time years ago in Nice. I didn't know it was murder, Miss Marple. I didn't know. Miss Marple reached across the table, patting her hand. Of course you didn't, but you knew enough to be afraid. That's why you left those 3 knots to mark where the secret was hidden. Iris nodded, sobbing quietly. It was in the lining. A piece of paper, names, numbers, all written in code. I thought the police would find it, but they never did. He must have taken it again. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. And where is that piece of paper now? The girl's voice was barely a whisper. Gone. After Reed was arrested, someone came here at night. They took it from the basket where I'd hidden it. Someone? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Who? I didn't see their face, Iris said, but they smelled of roses. Miss Marple sat very still. Roses, of course. The scent that clung to the Reverend's wife like remorse itself. But there was something more. Tell me, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. When you repaired the scarf, did you use your own thread? Iris shook her head. No, he brought it himself, gold thread from London. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. From London? Yes. He said it came from a tailor who owed him a favor. I remember because the spool was engraved with the initials, G.C. Miss Marple's breath caught, G.C. George Caldwell. A name whispered once in connection with Alistair Reed, a man said to move unseen between the ministry and the underworld. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, "you've done something far braver than you know." At that moment there came a soft knock at the door. Iris froze. "We're closed," she called, her voice trembling, but the door creaked open anyway. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was the vicar, his face pale, eyes hollow. "Reverend Clement," Miss Marple said evenly, "you gave us quite a start." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I came to ask Miss Bellamy for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I've done her a terrible wrong." Miss Marple's eyes never left him. "Oh? And what wrong would that be?" He hesitated. "I told Reed where to find her." Iris gasped. "You what?" Tangled among the wool was a small folded scrap of parchment, yellowed, brittle, and entirely out of place. Miss Marple frowned. She was meticulous about her basket. She would never have left paper among her thread, and yet there it was, tucked deep beneath a half-finished sock. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The paper was creased and faded, the ink smudged, but the words were still legible. "Delivered to G.C. at the Rose Cottage before midnight. Do not fail. Hem." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. G.C. George Caldwell. And Rose Cottage, why, that was a small property at the edge of the village, long empty since the war, but the initial M, that, she thought grimly, was no coincidence. "Mem for Marple," she whispered. "Or perhaps for murder." She rose, the basket slipping to the floor. "How very odd," she murmured. "Someone has been using my knitting as a post-box." Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his expression torn between alarm and admiration. "Good Lord, Miss Marple," he said, turning the note over. "How did this get into your basket?" "I suspect it was placed there last night," she said calmly, "while I entertained the Reverend." Craddock frowned. "You think someone broke in?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, no, my dear. They didn't need to. My door was unlocked intentionally. I left it so. You see, I was rather expecting company." He looked startled. "Expecting?" She smiled faintly. "Someone has been in my cottage before, Inspector. To watch, to listen, to move things ever so slightly. And last night they decided to hide their final message here, trusting that I'd never look for secrets among my wool." Craddock scowled. "So this proves there's still someone working with Caldwell." "Oh, I'm sure of it," Miss Marple said, her eyes glinting. "And they're right here in St. Mary Mead." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Tell me, Inspector, who owns Rose Cottage now?" Craddock hesitated. "It was purchased recently, under a false name, but the deed's holder was traced this morning." Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I see. And let me guess. The initials match the letter, don't they?" He nodded grimly. "Messy Margaret Clement." For a long moment Miss Marple said nothing. The fire crackled softly. "So," she murmured at last, "the vicar's wife wasn't just a frightened woman. She was the messenger all along." Craddock exhaled slowly. "You think she planted that note?" "I know she did," Miss Marple said, "and I rather imagine she intends to collect what she's owed tonight." She picked up her knitting needles, her expression composed but her eyes bright with anticipation. "Come along, Inspector," she said. "It seems we must follow the thread before it knots itself around another neck." Outside, the church bell tolled noon, echoing through the quiet streets. And in Miss Marple's steady hands, the needles began to click again, rhythmic, relentless, and full of secrets yet to unravel. Chapter 17. Midnight at Maple. Lodge. The moon hung pale and bruised over St. Mary Mead, its light spilling like cold milk across the deserted lanes. The air was thick with silence, the sort that feels watched. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Craddock at the gates of Maple Lodge, her shawl pulled tight against the creeping chill. The house loomed ahead, its windows black and blind. "She'll come," Miss Marple whispered. "Guilt is like a clock, Inspector. It always strikes at midnight." Craddock checked his watch. "If you're wrong, we're trespassing for nothing." "If I were wrong," she said softly, "you and I would be dead already." Inside the abandoned house, dust shimmered in the moonlight. The once grand parlor lay draped in white sheets, ghostly and waiting. In the center of the room stood a single table, and upon it a candle and a folded letter marked G.C., Caldwell's old signal. Miss Marple murmured. "She'll believe he sent word." Craddock hid behind the heavy curtains while Miss Marple took a chair near the doorway, her knitting in hand, as calm as if she were hosting afternoon tea. The clock in the hall began to toll 12. 1. 2. At the 9th chime the back door creaked open. The flickering candlelight caught a glimmer of pale silk. A figure slipped into the room, Margaret Clement, the vicar's wife. Her face was white, her movements urgent. She went straight to the table, trembling hands reaching for the letter. "Oh, Margaret," Miss Marple said softly. The woman gasped, spinning around. "You? What are you doing here?" "I might ask the same," Miss Marple said, rising. "You've come for your payment, haven't you?" For silence. Tears shone in Margaret's eyes. "I wanted to end it, I swear. I burned the papers, but there was one thing left. Caldwell said he'd come for it himself." "But Caldwell's in prison," Miss Marple said gently. "And you knew that. The person who told you otherwise, the one who sent you that note, wasn't Caldwell." Margaret's lips trembled. "Then who?" "Your husband," Miss Marple said. A low voice came from the doorway. "She's right." Reverend Clement stepped forward, the candlelight carving shadows across his face. His expression was hollow, half guilt, half relief. "I wrote the note," he said. "I couldn't have let her go to the police. She would have destroyed us both." Margaret stared at him, horror dawning. "You used me?" "I loved you," he whispered. "But I couldn't lose everything." The words hung like smoke. Then Craddock stepped from behind the curtain. "And now you'll lose your freedom, Reverend." The vicar straightened, his calm returning like a mask. "So it ends here?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It ends where it began, in greed and fear. The golden thread always strangles the one who spends it." As Craddock led the vicar away, Margaret collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple extinguished the candle. The room plunged into darkness, the air thick with the scent of dust and justice. Outside, the church bell tolled once more midnight's echo, fading into the fog. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the silence, her eyes glimmering in the dark. "The Lord may forgive," she whispered, "but St. Mary Mead never forgets." And with that, She turned toward the gate, her footsteps steady, leaving Maple Lodge to its ghosts and the golden secrets buried in its walls. Chapter 18. A tangle of lies and lace mourning crept reluctantly into St. Mary Mead. A pale gray light bleeding over rooftops and fences. The village, still murmuring about the events at Maple Lodge, had already begun to fold the night's scandal into tidy gossip. But Miss Marple was not content. She sat in her parlor with her teacup cooling beside her, a lace handkerchief spread across her lap. It was delicate, embroidered with tiny flowers, and it did not belong to her. She had found it last night at Maple Lodge, snagged on the edge of the broken chair where Margaret Clement had collapsed. A beautiful piece, handmade, trimmed with gold thread dot. Miss Marple's sharp eyes traced the stitching. "Not her work," she murmured. Her lace was plainer. "This hand is younger, lighter." And then she saw the faintest of initials worked into the corner in golden thread. "I.B. Iris Bellamy," she whispered, Dot the seamstress. The quiet girl with trembling hands and tearful eyes. The one who had played the victim so perfectly. Dot. Miss Marple's heart sank, not with shock, but with confirmation. She had always known the lacework was unfinished. Dot at 12:30. Inspector Craddock arrived, looking relieved but wary. "All done, Miss Marple," he said. "The Reverend will stand trial. His wife's confession matches your theory exactly. We can finally put this one to bed." Miss Marple gave a soft, knowing smile. "Oh, my dear Inspector, do sit down before you bruise your pride. The bed you've made still has thorns in it." Craddock frowned. "You mean there's more?" "Indeed. The Reverend was not the spider in this web, merely one of the flies." She handed him the lace handkerchief. "I found this at Maple Lodge. Tell me, Inspector, does this look like something a vicar's wife would own?" Craddock turned it over, brow furrowed. "This embroidery, it's gold thread. Costly work. And these initials I buy, Iris Bellamy," Miss Marple finished softly. "Our sweet little seamstress. She's been more than a mender of fabric. She's been mending truths. Every stitch of this case leads back to her." By the time they reached the shop on High Street, the bell over the door gave a cheerful jingle that felt almost mocking. Iris looked up from her workbench, smiling faintly. "Miss Marple." "Inspector." "Have they found the real culprit?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Oh, yes, my dear. They're looking at her." The girl froze. What do you mean?" "Your initials," Miss Marple said, holding up the lace. "You dropped this last night at Maple Lodge. You didn't repair Reed's scarf, you made it. The golden thread came from your own stock. You were Caldwell's first accomplice, weren't you?" Before the Reverend ever sinned. Tears welled in Iris's eyes, but her voice turned cold. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Miss Marple's tone softened. "I know enough. You began as a frightened girl, but fear turned to profit. You blackmailed the Clements, delivered letters for Reed, and when it all collapsed, you played the innocent. For a heartbeat, silence hung in the air. Then Iris's face crumpled. "I just wanted a better life." Miss Marple sighed almost kindly. "So do we all, my dear. But not everyone sews it out of lies and lace." As Craddock led the trembling seamstress away, Miss Marple looked out at the quiet street, where sunlight was just beginning to pierce the clouds. "Such pretty patterns," she murmured. But in the end, it's always the thread that strangles. And outside, the bell above the door jingled once more light, bright. And final dot, chapter 19. Miss Marple's Revelation. The drawing-room of Danemead Cottage had never held such an audience. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, arms folded. Lydia Duval sat pale and trembling by the window. The Reverend and his wife, each broken in their own silence, faced the fire. And Iris Bellamy, the seamstress who had hidden her crimes behind silk and tears, sat rigid. Her hands bound in her lap. At the center of it all sat Miss Marple, serene as a chess master surveying the final move. The golden scarf, now dull and frayed, lay across her table like a fallen crown. "I asked you all here," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "because this affair, though tangled, is finally complete. The truth, you see, is not a thread, it is a tapestry." Craddock sighed. "Then let's unravel it, Miss Marple. Who truly started all this?" Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her blue eyes keen. "It began not with greed, but with love. Iris Bellamy, poor girl, was not Caldwell's victim. She was his lover. He found her in nice, young, and eager, and taught her the art of deceit as one might teach embroidery. Together they wove a network of smugglers, using her skill with silk to encode messages within fabrics." Iris flinched. "I didn't mean for anyone to die." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said softly, "but death follows greed as surely as night follows dusk. When Caldwell turned on you, you found a new accomplice, Alistair Reed. You gave him the coded scarf. You told him how it worked. And when the trail grew too dangerous, you sent the scarf to Lydia Duval, hoping suspicion would fall on her instead." Lydia gasped. "She used me?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, you were a convenient scapegoat, wealthy, lonely, and tied to the same Riviera circle. And when Victor Larocque threatened to expose the ring, you all played your parts. Reed strangled him with this very scarf. The golden thread became a noose. The room was utterly silent. And as for the Reverend," Miss Marple continued, her tone sad rather than condemning, "he stumbled upon it all by accident. His wife's letters to Larocque, Iris's deliveries, Caldwell's donations. He saw the pattern but lacked the courage to face it. When Reed returned, he believed he could contain the damage. But sin, once invited, never leaves politely." Craddock spoke softly. "So in the end, every one of them played a part." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. A tangle of lies knotted by vanity, pride, and fear, all for a bit of gold thread." She lifted the scarf gently, its shimmer now faded. "This was never treasure. It was temptation, and temptation, Inspector, always looks lovely until it tightens." As the constables led Iris Bellamy away, the candlelight danced across Miss Marple's calm face. Craddock turned to her, shaking his head. "I'll never understand how you see it all so clearly." Miss Marple smiled, reaching for her knitting needles. "It's simple, my dear Inspector. People are like patterns. Once you know the stitch, the rest unravels itself. Outside, the wind whispered through St. Mary Mead, carrying the last echo of the scandal away, and Miss Marple, serene as ever, began a new row of stitches, golden. Of course, chapter 20. The truth wrapped in gold, the sun set over St. Mary Mead in a blaze of fading gold, the same color as the thread that had bound together so many lies. The scandal was over, the guilty taken, The village whispering itself back to peace. Miss Marple sat alone in her garden, the golden scarf folded neatly across her lap. It no longer glittered. Its luster had dimmed, dulled by the touch of too many hands, greedy, desperate, frightened. She traced one frayed edge with her fingertip. So much wickedness, she murmured, for something meant only to be beautiful. From the churchyard came the toll of evening bells, soft, forgiving. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes misting. "Gold, you see," she whispered, "is never the sin. It's the shimmer in the heart that makes people blind." She tied the scarf once more, knotted it carefully, and placed it in her drawer. A relic not of wealth, but of warning. And as twilight wrapped the village in its quiet hush, Miss Marple began to knit again, another pattern, another story, her needles clicking softly beneath the golden light of truth, and the story ended.